opportunity, the betterment of the patients that we're all here to serve, and also to make sure that for our clinical colleagues, we're not adding inefficiencies. We really need to keep all stakeholders in mind, and the best way to do that is to partner and collaborate. So the way I thought I'd use time today is, I say this now, we'll see, do a little bit of a sort of shorter presentation, knowing the overlap in our work and in our mission. I'll try and leave some good time for discussion. With that in mind, I've taken a bit of a punchy position on a few things, and the intent there is to really set us up for a great conversation. The other piece that I did, and John, Megan, I'll make sure that you get my slides afterwards. You can use them, distribute them. I'll go through a lot of data points quite quickly. Everything's got a reference. And then there's a pretty meaty appendix as well, listing out a lot of the resources that we've developed through our work at Dime, including through partnership with the centers team. So all of that will be available, but let's spend our time sort of almost having more of a sort of look to current state, look to the future, think about how we can connect the dots, and then let's dive into discussion. So I always think it's useful to remind ourselves the variety of different ways that folks look at the evolution of digital health. What does it mean to different stakeholders? Some people will look at a graph like this and be like, hurrah, look at all the money that's getting poured into this. Look at the opportunity. And I think that becomes particularly compelling if we actually look at a global market, right? Here, there's a claim that $504 billion will be the value of sort of the world sort of digital health market. And that's important. It's important for us to think about the different ways that folks look at this. I also think it's important from another point of view. I said that I'd sort of be a little bit punchy now and again, and I'll start right now. When I think about the size of the US healthcare economy, it is last count something like $3.7 trillion. That's significantly bigger than the GDP of France. And I would assume that if someone went in for a conversation with President Macron and told him that they had an app that was going to change France, period, that would be taken with a grain of salt. And I think we need to think the same when it comes to individual digital solutions. We need to be thinking much more at the ecosystem level. This is an enormous and complex and cumbersome sort of industry that serves every single person in the US and globally, with millions of folks employed by this field. We really need to stop thinking about what's this one widget, this one algorithm going to do, but rather how do these powerful sets of tools come together in the service of really redefining healthcare? And that's the sort of the approach, the tact I want to take in our conversation today. So again, I tried to scope this a little bit to focus in on digital measures. So where are we with digital measures? We can look to the media, and tremendous sort of scientific journalists are reporting that healthcare is undergoing a monumental shift towards remote patient monitoring in recent months. So from sort of the tail end of last year through to today, we've seen 3 of the 5 biggest companies in the world sort of lean into this space. We've got the Amazon Halo, Fitbit, which is now owned by Google, actually has a clearance, as does the Apple Watch. These are enormous organizations. They see something here. What are they saying? And what can we show them about what the needs of patients are, what the needs of clinicians are, what the needs of the field are? It's also really interesting to think about sort of how these tools, how these resources have been used during the pandemic, because I think that maybe gives us a little bit more of a sort of honest assessment of current state. So I believe it was last April that we saw in some of the Medicare data that telehealth increased by 12,000% at its peak. And yet we actually did some research, our organization Dime, in partnership with Mayo Clinic, the AMA, MITRE, and a variety, ATA, and some other organizations as part of the COVID-19 Healthcare Coalition. We did a lot of research. We looked at claims data. We did a nationwide physician survey and a nationwide patient survey in multiple languages. And what we derived from that was, during the pandemic, only 11% of encounters, according to our data, used any kind of remote patient monitoring or data derived from that to inform decisions. Now, let's again take that with a grain of salt. First of all, I certainly don't think it should be 100%. I'm not sure what the correct number is. I don't think any of us know, but that 11% number seems low. Now, the other thing is, the entire industry turned on a dime, and sort of kudos to, that was quite a good Freudian misspeak there, that, kudos to our clinical colleagues, and none of the workflows existed. But still, 11% seems low. And what are we actually doing if we are serious about this idea of redefining healthcare, to think about the data flows and not just sort of shoehorn these widgets into existing practices to be tethered to the visit, even if it's not happening in person? How can we really think about changing the way we deliver care? And there was another interesting data point that came out of this study, which was, I think it's in 40% of those instances where remote patient monitoring was used, there was only a single snapshot of data that was ever reviewed. It was in the moment of the visit. It wasn't any sort of continuous monitoring over time. There was no sort of between visit oversight. There were no flags, nothing pre-programmed. So again, that says to me, how are we actually using this information? We're not getting any of the value out of these digital measures. And all we're doing is giving yet another static data point for busy clinical colleagues to look at. And we're not sort of really repositioning ourselves at all to benefit. It's just another layer of the onion. And I think that's something at this moment of intentionality, we have to be eyes wide open to. So that's on the care side. I know that this is a really interdisciplinary audience. So I also wanted to think about where we are on the research side. So I'm going to take you through a little journey of a resource we built at Dime. So in October 2019, we launched our crowdsourced library of digital endpoints. And I will share, we were beside ourselves. We couldn't believe it. October 2019, we found that 12 industry sponsors were using 34 unique endpoints, not in validation studies, not in feasibility studies, but actually to answer questions about new medical products under development. And we thought, my goodness, this is terrific. The future is not the future. We're here now. And we were so excited. In fact, we went ahead, we did a Stat News op-ed on everything. Fast forward to where we are today, extraordinary growth. We actually now see 62 sponsors using these digital endpoints in trials of new medical products. We can see that well over half are being used in phase 2 and phase 3. We can see that almost, check my math here, coming up on a third are being used as primary endpoints. And we've seen them being used across different sorts of medical products. But 207 is an awful lot. And the piece that gives me pause here is if we actually look, and this is an open source resource, so you can go in and you can mine this database. We maintain it. It's always up to date as best as the information we have. Every single one of those endpoints, including 60 something measures of physical activity, 50 something measures of sleep, are unique. Now they may cut across different therapeutic areas, but to me, we're not honing in yet on what the key measures are. We're not putting ourselves in a position where we can say, we've talked to patients, we have a deep understanding of the facet of their condition that's most important to them. We've thought critically about how we apply technology to this, and we're capturing it in such a way that we can actually pool data sets. We can start to do meta-analyses. We can get a rapid understanding of the history of disease, or the natural history of disease, across different types of patient populations. We know what minimally clinically important change looks like. We understand the difference between natural variability in individual person and across populations versus actual progression of a condition. We're not doing any of those things. And I think that this is a real call to action for all of us in the field. There's been a bit of an army of one approach to developing digital measures in particular. And I think that if we sort of reflect on some of the information I've shared, and hopefully we can get into this during the discussion, it's really important that all of us involved hit pause for a hot second and think about, of the information we have, are we actually positioning ourselves to be able to make clinical decisions at scale based on this? Or is there just an awful lot of quite expensive data floating around the place? One is obviously best situation, the other is not. So that was a little bit on current state. I want to make a pivot now, and I want to sort of imagine something that I think about optimistically often. So imagine a future state of healthcare in which a successful healthcare system is defined by the health of individuals it's there to serve, as opposed from how well we can come in and pinch hit and deliver treatment once an individual is sick. one of the tremendous things about using these technologies is we can get so much information while each individual is outside of the walls of the hospital, outside of the walls of the clinic. And especially knowing where the sort of chronic disease burden that both the population we serve faces and the clinical system faces, there's so much opportunity here. And I like to sort of ground this in something a little bit more tangible. And I know that many of you are clinicians and you will have better examples than me, but there are 3 examples that I always find really compelling about, why is it that, we are so passionate about the promise of these digital clinical measures. From some oncology colleagues, patients who are facing I learned that patients who are running into a bone marrow transplant have to come in about 5 times in the 2 weeks before their surgery to have their vitals monitored to check that they are stable enough for surgery. This is likely a patient who's been ill for an extended period of time. There's likely a pretty significant sort of care partner burden. They're also immunosuppressed and they're coming in for surgery. And all we're really doing is monitoring their vitals. Like, honestly, beyond, like, it blows my mind. We have the technical capabilities to be doing all of that at home. And not only would that be more efficient for the system, I think about the burden to the patient. Like, this is a very challenging period in their life. And like, I think we should be respecting them. I think it's an ethical decision to move these sorts of monitoring out into the home, given that the technical capabilities are there. Another example, and a couple of things popped up together, but that's fine. Another example is Duchenne's muscular dystrophy is always a condition that sort of gives me pause. For folks on the line who might not know the natural history of Duchenne's, it typically affects boys and young men. Roughly, these boys are diagnosed at about 7 years of age. By about 13 years old, unfortunately, they lose their ambulatory capacity and they are confined to a wheelchair. And unfortunately, there is no disease modifying therapy, and life expectancy is in the early 20s. The gold standard for both clinical research and for care, outside of a muscle biopsy for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, is the 6-minute walk test, which systematically excludes 60% of those patients from being able to participate. So not only is it then challenging for us to monitor their condition, it also means that we aren't targeting 60% of those patients for new therapies. And our ability to do things that measure aspects of their life that are important are enormous. We could measure their ability to complete their homework, their ability to text with their friends, to play video games, to feed themselves, to take themselves to the toilet. These are young boys, and we could give them all of that dignity. We could measure it, we could focus on it in their care, we could focus on it in the new drugs that we're trying to develop, and current measures don't do that. I imagine, you could imagine a cool smartwatch or a smart ring or anything like that, really giving us enormous insights into sort of the lives of these boys, allowing us to better care for them. That to me is the potential of these measures. And I'll pile on with one more thing quickly and then we'll move on. I think the other piece, and again, another sort of staggering statistic, and I'm sure this is familiar to some of you, but it still gives me pause. Typically, a Parkinson's patient is diagnosed sort of 4 or 5 times in the course of their disease. And then in the US, last statistics I looked at, to the best of my knowledge, 40% of patients with Parkinson's die before they ever see a neurologist due to the maldistribution of patients with Parkinson's who need that care and the neurologists who are able to provide that expert care. If we think about the capability of measures to help us with research, but also to connect those specialists with those patients who need their care, that possibility is enormous. So we think back to the first slide, right, which was the sort of, almost like a hockey stick sort of peak in investment in digital health. On the one side, I'm not going to knock it. It's great. There's plenty of reasons, but I think the reason we need to be excited is because of these problems to solve. And we need to think about solving it at the systems level. Again, a sort of cautionary tale. I won't hammer this too much, and I'm certain this is something that's reflected by everyone on the line. I think the promise of being able to mine all of this data, whether for research or care, is enormous. I think the cautionary tale here for me is we need to make sure this isn't noise. We need to make really, really sure that we are measuring things that matter, whether clinically or to the patient in terms of their life. We need to make sure that we have a good sense of the quality of that data. And we need to make sure that this enormous pool of data is actually safe and isn't causing any sorts of harm to the patients through misuse or through leakage. we're dealing with new systems. We need new expertise from cybersecurity colleagues. We need to do more with our ethicist colleagues to really think about how these new data streams can be triangulated. De-identification is challenging when we think about data from sensor technology. Some people would even argue it's not possible. So there's an awful lot to think about as we try and pursue the promise of all of these new measures. I wanted to give also just a sort of hot second of backdrop. I think that whenever we do find ourselves at these watershed moments, it's interesting to think about what the driving factors are and what's behind this. We obviously have the driving factor of the pandemic, but there are other things, you know, and healthcare has been in crisis, quite frankly. There have been pressing and persistent challenges around access, around health equity, around affordability, around quality of care in the US in particular. That's not new. So what is it that makes us so bullish about the promise of these technologies right now? I think digital capabilities have come of age, right? And we can look at that across a number of different sort of domains. We can think about sensor capabilities. We can think about broader access to things like broadband. We can also say we now in some places have 10 years of longitudinal data from the EHR. It's been awful for our clinical colleagues to get this data. It's been a real sort of challenge. We know that our clinical colleagues probably hate their computers more than anything else at work, but it's there. We also have new sort of computing capabilities, right? When we think about these streams of data from sensors, when we think about these enormous opportunities to sort of understand through data people's experience of their condition and their lives, we can derive meaning from that because we have these new sort of capabilities. I also think there's a really important social component that we sort of find at this time, which is the way in which we're using technology in every other area of our life. And there was a really lovely report actually, and I think it's about 18 months old now, but from the World Economic Forum about digital expectations. They really talk about sort of present and future generations having expectations that are very, very different to sort of what we thought about previously, especially for those individuals raised as digital natives. They're not just adopting technologies, they really actually see immediately, without any need for education, the many, many ways in which technology can improve their lives. So, you know, how do we lean into this? There's an opportunity where people are very excited. They're much more motivated than ever to really be active participants in their health as a result of COVID. And there's also this technology driver. How do we intentionally pair those two drivers to improve lives, to improve the healthcare system? And if we marry other things, right, there's not just in digital natives, I think all of us, right, we think less about products and services and more about experiences. That's the way we consume now. We think about hyper-personalization from our Amazon feed, and I'm sorry to say, still use it, so convenient. Our Netflix feed, right, there's always the suggestion. They know me better than I know myself. They know what I want to read. They know what I want to watch. They know the next like sporty gadget I need to buy for the garage because it's still not safe to go back to the gym, right? We do that in many other facets of health. Why can't we do that for the patients that we serve? We have sufficient information. How are we going to harness it to deliver that? I think the other piece that's important is the sort of ownership to access model. We see that from things like ride shares. We see that from car shares. We see that from sort of Airbnb. I think it also applies to data as well. And I think one of the things that's incumbent on us as a field is to really think about how do we maintain a fidelity to how patients want us to use their data. And once we understand that, sort of push the limits on access as far as patients are comfortable, right? Data doesn't live in a manila folder locked in a file cabinet anymore. We don't process it on, I'm thinking of old IRB submissions, you know, on networked computers to do our statistics, right? Ostensibly, it could be free flowing. It could be the sort of the fuel that runs the sort of the healthcare innovation economy on. But we have to be respectful. There's a lot to think about there. But we've done it in other areas. And frankly, it's something that consumers are very comfortable with if we can get it right, if we can be trustworthy, and if we can be meeting their needs and preferences. So I want to go back. The focus here really is on digital health measurement for our discussion today, at least. And, you know, I really do think we're at a crossroads. And that's why I think this sort of intentionality is so important, right? How are we making sure that we're actually using all of this information from digital measures of health to improve care, not violate privacy? How are we thinking about taking a data-driven approach to public health and not just powering harmful surveillance? How do we think about the fact that we can use these tools that ostensibly can reach anywhere to actually improve healthcare access, to improve health equity, as opposed to just making things better for the privileged few? These are questions that we can't just say, oh, this is an uncomfortable question, I'm going to go here and work on my algorithm and my one pilot. We have to be thinking about those. It's incumbent on all of us who are here and building this to be tackling these hard questions. So I want to pivot and fit a few sort of opportunities, I think, for us, and then let's throw it open to discussion. What actually needs to happen to sort of make this future vision of healthcare real? One of the things we think about, for example, is, should we now be thinking about broadband as a social determinant of health? We can look here, we see sort of red areas. This is just one indicator, but improved health outcomes relative to the rest of the population from the Dartmouth Atlas. Maps almost perfectly to where there's really good broadband access. So if all we're doing is helping people with good broadband access, again, we're going back to helping the privileged few and not anywhere near coming close to using the power of these digital technologies to advance the system for everyone. There's also a really terrific article that came out a couple of months ago by colleagues at the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, who we're fortunate enough to work with through our Data CC initiative. I've popped the link here. And one of the things that we're actively thinking about at DIME is this idea of sort of digital inclusion. So rather than always thinking about sort of disparities, how do we use a language that is more of a call to action? How can we be digitally inclusive in everything we do? A straw man definition, this is by no means final, and I'm sharing this because I welcome thoughts, is around, specifically for digital health digital inclusion refers to activities and practices throughout product development, deployment, evaluation, and commercialization. These activities are necessary to respond to the needs of all populations and enable all individuals and communities to benefit from digital health measurement data. This is something that I think has to be at the forefront of all of our thinking, and I welcome some good discussion on this in just a minute or two. Issues of data privacy, right? Data governance. How are we thinking about these enormous data flows and making sure that we are using them to help populations, individuals, subpopulations, and not harm them? We've done a good amount of work on this. There's also a really terrific publication, if you guys haven't accessed it before, by Devon McGraw and Ken Mandel, really terrific. And again, I've sort of linked that here. We've also sort of kicked back and forth at DIME this idea that we might need to redefine patient safety even in the digital era, right? How do we actually think about the definition of harm in the digital era? And actually, I'm going to share very transparently the sort of thought exercise we went through. We think we need to think differently about patient safety. We stop short, and I'll tell you why, of saying we need to redefine it. There's a really lovely definition of patient safety from the World Health Organization, and it thinks about the absence of preventable harm, the reduction of risk of unnecessary harm. An acceptable minimum refers to the collective notions of given current knowledge, resources available, and in the context in which care was delivered, weighed against the risk of non-treatment or other treatment. We don't think we need to redefine it, but we think there are a couple of different areas that take on a different set of thinking when it comes to digital. The types of harm are different, right? People are at risk from data leakage, data misuse. There's conditions like orthosomnia, where people are so obsessed with their sleep data, they actually start sleeping worse. There are all of these sort of, we can think about, people have been talking about the polysomnography. Does it work well enough across different skin tones? There are all of these, if we're not applying rigorous testing to algorithms, are we ensuring that there's an absence of bias, or at least we're eyes wide open to what the bias is before we apply them? Those harms are different. So are the risks, right? I think, as we think about sort of risk reward calculations, that takes on a different sort of tone in the digital era. I also think current knowledge is different. I would argue that digital health is one of the most interdisciplinary fields I can think of. I don't have great current knowledge of cybersecurity, but I know I need to talk to someone who does. Algorithmic bias is something I understand to a reasonable degree. I know we can use pretty biased data sets. I know as long as we're testing them and I can see the test data in a representative data set, I'm going to feel reasonably good about it. But our knowledge is limited. The resources available to get these things right aren't optimized for the digital era, and the context in which care was delivered has changed significantly. It is not in the presence of a physician or the clinician within the clinic. That context has changed dramatically. How does that change our thinking? And so I think it's really important, actually, that because we all understand this concept of safety in healthcare, I think we can use it powerfully to actually look more at the risks and use this definition to help us reduce harms. There's another piece, and we're actually sort of actively starting a project on this at Dime in the fall, which is around the idea of, the level of challenges when it comes to actually making these data speak to one another. The challenge of data integrations, from making sure that we're not using a sort of random leaky SDK to get the data in, and then it comes in a horrible zip file and you can barely use it. You have some biases as you sort of manipulate it to get it into the cloud platform that you need, and it's probably just about good enough to use it once. Like, that is not optimal. What we really want to have is a very, very sort of thoughtful integrations process where we have a standardized ontology for what all of these things mean to try and reduce the bias, that we take an interoperable approach, that there's a sort of very well-defined sort of integrations process, that we are making this data available to everyone, including the patient, in the same way, and that there is broad access as it's permitted by consent. These are the opportunities around how we use data. And for all of the promise, we've got a lot of work to do before we actually get to that situation. Another piece, and this is why I think the work that you guys do at the center is so critically important. We talked about the interdisciplinary nature of the field. We need to start training a workforce. We have at a number of different levels. It can't be clinical over here and over there at arm's length. We have our tech colleagues, and I guess when we're finally ready for them, when we've almost made all of the decisions, we'll demand a solution. We need to be much more collaborative. We need to have a, frankly, like bilingual workforce across clinical speak and tech speak and expertise. We also need to think about the importance of, ethics. We need to also have a much more representative pool of candidates who we are developing anyway. This sort of clinical workforce isn't as diverse and representative as it should be. The tech workforce is certainly not. We need to make sure that we actually do better when we bring them together, rather than sort of amplify the lack of representation in the team. And we need to be intentional at building these teams, at building these workforces going forward. So that's something you guys do really well at the center. I mentioned our collaborative community, where we're focused on digital health measurement. We're tackling digital inclusion and some of these sort of big ticket structural challenges. We also do a lot of work with virtual first care through our impact initiative that we do in partnership with the ATA. Not necessarily thinking that virtual first care is either the right solution in every situation, in many it won't be, or that it's any sort of silver bullet. But the piece that gets me excited about what we can learn from virtual first is we don't have to re-engineer existing workflows. There is an opportunity with these newer organizations to actually build them from scratch, build them around the patient, and build them in an era where we have the whole suite of digital tools, whether that's communications, whether that's data, whether that's sensing, at our fingertips. What does it look like? What is the blueprint, right? If we're not trying to re-engineer existing workflows. And then the one other resource that I wanted to share is something that we were delighted to collaborate with the center on, which is our playbook, Advancing Digital Clinical Measures. This is a really powerful, and I'm proud to say, comprehensive resource that we were delighted to partner with the best in the industry to develop. It's a meaty playbook. If you want to read it start to finish, it's about 350 slides, but it really does walk you through all of the considerations we've touched on today. It's very much a how-to guide, and it's supported by over 100 action-oriented tools, from decision matrices to checklists. There's an entire educational sort of curriculum in there. It really, really is intended to sort of meet the field where it is and hopefully move us together and in the right direction. So with that, I think I semi-achieved my goal of keeping this on the shorter side. I'm really excited for a terrific discussion.
Thank you, Jen. That was terrific and super interesting. And I think a bunch of folks will be looking through that playbook with interest. So I'll start off with a question, and then we'll open it up to the kind of larger audience. For folks, you're welcome to put yourself on video to ask, or to raise your hand for me to call on you. So, my first question is, I love kind of your point about that the 200 plus measures that are out there with very little standardization, this quick explosion in the number of measures that are being used. What do you see as the most important next step in terms of getting standardized or common measures, digital measures among trials?
Yeah, I think, and this is actually something we're kicking the tires on, so really excited to have the opportunity to chat through this with you, Megan, and the rest of the team. We've been chatting a little with regulatory colleagues and with colleagues in industry about appetite around sort of developing a core set of measures, right? How can we maybe convene clinicians and patients, maybe from sort of big therapeutic areas, or maybe around a particular measure, right? Sleep, incredibly complicated. There's certainly not going to be just one measure of sleep. But what are the 3 or 4 features of sleep or features of activity, right, that are broadly meaningful, that we can collectively agree is going to be important and serve large amounts of the population, that we have the patient voice on that, that regulatory colleagues have been at the table during those conversations, that clinical colleagues who rely on that sort of information see value in it? Can we come to, a short list of core measures, and at that point allow innovation to take off, and at that point allow sort of tech to kick in, and at that point even allow competition to kick in, right? If we're all pointing in the same direction, what I'm suspicious of is that then that's when we'll start to see progress, because we're generating the sort of data that we can look across and learn across. We're going to much more quickly understand how that measures functions, and all of the stakeholders are going to trust it much more quickly. So curious to get folks' reaction to that, but that's sort of where we're thinking over at Dime at the moment.
I think that makes sense. One of the things that I'm always really careful about kind of for the non-digital measures is around their validation and replicability. And so one thing, and it may be in that lovely measures table that you kind of gave us the quick overview already already, but kind of data around the accuracy of those measures and accuracy across different types of populations and over time. So but I will cede the floor now to other folks who may have questions. I have more, but I'm sure that others do as well. Our group is not usually shy.
Megan, I can go. It's Brenda. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. That was really interesting to see the outcomes, and I completely agree about how it should be a multidisciplinary approach, including tech as well as healthcare folks. One area that I think has been a barrier, as I've just talked to people in general about this, is privacy, data privacy concerns, and HIPAA. I know you had briefly mentioned a little bit about that. I just didn't know in your research if you've found ways that you could work with the HIPAA guidelines and kind of prevent that data leakage.
So it's really interesting. I think that, and this is very much my opinion, HIPAA's been around for 20 years, and I actually think it's a terrific bit of, I'm going to misspeak, policy legislation. It's terrific. I think the challenge that I see with sort of HIPAA today is that it's limited. I think a lot of data is being generated outside of what HIPAA covers. So whether that's you are working with a counselor who is not a covered entity because actually it's all out of pocket because we can't figure out how to reimburse these things, right? Or even through your employer, right? If they're not accepting insurance, none of that data is covered by HIPAA. And I think that's really important. We're also starting to see, a deep understanding of the data that we simply sit around generating all day, nothing to do with our healthcare, whether it's from, the person who's probably recording the whole thing secondarily through the mic of my phone, whether it's through the GPS data that I have, whether it's through sort of the information on a smartwatch, whether it's the way I text, I type, the way I scroll through my social media. All of these sort of data points can be incredibly powerful. And Brenda, you're exactly right. There's no checks and measures that sort of protect people from this. There are data aggregators who do sort of hoover up all of this information, and we use it for good, right? We use it to think about where we need to be increasing resources, where we need to be updating the sewer system because there's a higher population there than we thought, and people aren't sort of responding to the census for a variety of different reasons. There's lots of good reasons that a data aggregator may exist, but there's also plenty of opportunity, and there are some stories. I'll share some specific examples around risk for misuse. So if, for example, we can see that you've had a very sort of active day based on your sort of smartwatch, and then we can see at 7 o'clock based on your GPS, you spent 15 minutes parked in front of a liquor store, and then at 2 o'clock that morning, you're all over your sort of social media, incorporating a new company, right? We might make some sort of inferences about potentially being in a manic state. We've actually seen situations where that information, not exactly those data streams, have actually triggered social media platforms to start selling people flights to Vegas, right? They're not using that information to say, we should connect this person with a counselor, we should do this, we should do that, we should do the other. This is fantastic. We know that they're going to buy this $400 flight to Vegas leaving tomorrow. Similar situation, a bit less dramatic, is that researchers at Microsoft actually did some fascinating research. I think I'm going to get the numbers correct, but with 99% specificity, Microsoft researchers could identify 15% of early stage pancreatic cancer patients based on nothing more than their Google. It was probably Bing searches if it was Microsoft, but based on nothing more than their search engine sort of behaviors. That's enormously powerful information, especially if we think about something like pancreatic cancer, where your only sort of opportunity is to catch that early. But who is responsible for that data? Who's looking at that data, right? If you send that data to a clinician or even back to the patient with that information, hugely powerful, could absolutely save lives. What if that information goes to a life insurance company? What if that information goes to your health insurance company? What if that information goes to the student loan company and you wanted to support your kid through college, right? That's when the harms start to happen. And Vrinda, you're exactly right that nothing's there. So that's the piece that I think we need to address. I actually think that HIPAA is brilliant. I just don't think it's sufficiently comprehensive, but really keen to hear from you.
Oh yeah, no, I completely agree with all of that. And I agree with the data piece too, to be able to kind of get those interventions early. For me, it's just more like with digital health being newer, do certain things like HIPAA have to be altered to kind of adapt to that sort of digital health space as well. But those points were extremely helpful. Thank you.
Vrinda, just to riff off that for a hot second, actually, Lucia Savage, who's over at Omada and was previously at HHS and is just brilliant. She has some really good thoughts on this, which is the one thing that's actually really important in innovation in particular is some kind of stability. So when I listen to that, like what I think is, it doesn't seem to me that we necessarily have to sort of blow up HIPAA in any way. In fact, I think that actually could be bad. I think there should be real certainty around what HIPAA is, especially so these new organizations can plan on it and health systems can plan on it. I do think it needs to be augmented. So, that's just you sort of nudged me there to have that reflection. And I think that was really good insight from Lucia.
I'll check that out. Thank you.
I'm going to ask a question from David Raths that he's asked for me to ask on his behalf. He wants to know, are there some good examples of organizations who've developed digital clinical quality measures with patients to make sure they're meaningful to patients, right? So I think this gets at a great question that you alluded to, Jen, during your talk of kind of this. I was in a talk earlier this morning with a representative from one of the patient advocacy organizations, right? There's the nothing for us without us. Mm-hmm. And so we can create the very best measures in the world, but if they're meaningless as a quality measure, if it's not something that's actually centered, if it's not actually an outcome that they care about, right, then it doesn't really matter. So do you have any examples of organizations that have either successfully done that work or that probably more likely are starting to do that work of co-developing measures that are meaningful to patients? And I'll put one more spin on it, which is, or maybe they're taking the measures and presenting them in ways that are meaningful to patients. Maybe there's a layer of interpretation on the other side.
Yeah, I think increasingly because of challenges with retention and sort of enrollment in the first place, both our research sort of colleagues and our developer colleagues are realizing that they need to get much better at this. And also that it's not a one touch, right? That's not going to be enough. And actually, David, I'm going to flip your question on its head to start with, and then I'm going to come back and actually answer it. I'm not sure how many people saw this, but a few weeks ago, FDA actually rejected a letter of intent from Verily, who I actually think had a tremendous piece of technology. they had done extraordinary work in their engineering team, and even in their sort of user experience work, right, of the tool. It was a watch that they happened to use as the hardware. They did a fully digital measure of part 3, so the mobility portion of the UPDRS, the Unified Parkinson Disease Rating Scale. So it was perfectly mapped, right? Every single one of those exercises they could record. They showed that it was correctly assessing those. And FDA said, we don't care because patients don't say it. You know, there isn't sufficient information to show that this battery of tests, like how much does this actually matter to a Parkinson's patient, right? That was, I think, a landmark decision that reminds us that just doing a copy of paste of measures that may be entrenched, but maybe aren't terribly meaningful to patients is not going to be the pathway forward. And I think a really powerful signal to the field that we have to do this well. In terms of companies, I would say it's much, I would be hard pressed to, David, get at that at the company level. There are definitely teams within companies that are developing really thoughtful measures that to make this a priority, whether it's talking to patients at all, whether it's talking to diverse patients. I think the actual useful place to look is what are the sort of intermediary organizations that can help us all do this well, right? Because if we keep going back to the usual suspects, we're not actually getting a representative sample of patients anyway. I think of organizations like the Savvy Co-op, which is run by Jen Horenjeff, who's a powerful patient advocate, but she's actually set up a nonprofit as a cooperative. So every single patient that we work with actually, or that Savvy works with, has a stake in the game, and they have incredibly well-trained and diverse patients. There's also another organization called Couch Health that is very, very good at connecting both tech developers and clinical experts interested in using technology with very, very diverse populations. And so, David, I almost look to the middle layer as the best bellwether there.
I love that. And I'm going to just kind of put a pin in it, which is that what I'm hearing you say, Jen, is both, right, that this needs to be developed by academics. This needs to be developed by kind of industry, but it also needs to be led by folks that can bridge those two and that specifically represent the patient perspective. And that we, those of us here at the Center for Digital Health who have our feet in the clinical or in the research realm, can have a role to play, but that it's through that partnership that we can really help to influence the development of these measures. Is that
I just need to carry you around with me and have you be my interpreter. That was a really nice summary, and I'm not failing to pay attention. I'm actually just grabbing a preprint of a manuscript that John, myself, and some other colleagues worked on as part of the playbook. I'll drop the link, but actually we have a preprint that's currently under review at JIMA that actually teases out the landscape of academic research into these tools. And I think some of the findings are really compelling. So let me scroll through it really quickly. And then when I find the table, I'll share, so I'm not making everyone seasick. But it's really interesting actually to look at the landscape of activity in academic research in particular, because I feel very, very strongly that we depend on academic researchers across the board for sort of high quality, not uninterested, but disinterested sort of research that actually allows us to sort of trust in new methods and new products. Okay, I think I'm finally here. So let me share my screen, and thank you everyone for your patience. I can drop a link, or John knows this particular work very well, so I'm sure he could do the same thing too. It's not the greatest resolution, but we actually did a systematic review, really, really deep dive into the sort of published literature with the majority of academic sort of co-authors, and sort of passed out and categorized the kind of research that was being conducted into digital health measurement. So we can actually see that, I think it's quite encouraging to see measure identification being quite well served. This is very small if you can't see it. Let me see if I can do this. Oh, the resolution is so bad, I'm not actually sure that makes it better, I'm sorry. I'll send the original PDF instead of just a viewer, that we're doing a lot of work on verification. So i.e. are the sensors trustworthy, analytical validation. I think this is really important because this is not just algorithm performance, but also does it perform well across all of the sort of patients that we're here to serve. Clinical validation, again, really important. Can we actually understand the measure in context? We're also seeing a lot of operations research analysis, which is good, right? Because we talked about the sort of failure to sort of re-engineer workflows to date. We can't just shoehorn these things in. And then U&U, which you probably can't read, I just know that it is, the sort of usability and utility. What I find alarming when I look at this is there was one, in the 2 years that we looked at, there was one paper published on the security of these technologies and the data flow, one on data rights and governance, nothing that we could find that directly put ethics in conversation with the questions of digital measurement. Economic feasibility, right? You can get the perfect tool, can we pay for it? So it was really interesting. I think there are areas that I felt really good about, and some of the gaps I felt frankly alarming. It was also really interesting to look at how these studies are funded. And if you actually, one of the things that I think is really interesting, again, you're just looking at it in a viewer, so I apologize, it's not the best, but in this, we actually did sort of some detailed analysis of where the funding is coming from. So, government's actually funding a lot of the operations piece, which is terrific, and less of the early stage, should we actually trust this measure in the first place? It's really interesting to look across the distribution. On the one hand, 100% of this work on security has been funded by the government, but when that's one manuscript, that's not enough. So we need to think about, like, how do we actually sort of work with the other critical stakeholders in sort of the world of academic productivity? How do we talk to the funders? Right? How do we actually make sure that through RFIs and other sort of mechanisms, that the RFAs actually reflect the needs of the field? I think that's a huge gap and something we get into in this paper. It was, John, great to work on this with you and other colleagues. And I think that it's still in preprint stage, so we've been a little quiet on it, but as soon as it's sort of finally out in the world, we'll really make sure that this information gets around, because I think it's important.
And there's a question here from Arcana. Did you guys look at how many of the studies had patient input? Was that one of your measures in your systematic review as to whether patients were part of the development or not?
Yeah, I was just curious if you had looked into that.
I don't think we did this here. We were simply trying to categorize the flavor of research that was being done, not the quality of that research. However, I'm going to show you something else that's actually in the appendix of the deck that I'll send around. One thing that we did develop very much in response, Arcana, to sort of the question that you're asking.
It's Archana. Thank you.
Oh, I apologize.
I'm so sorry.
No worries.
I just read it off the bottom of the box, so that's my fault. I apologize. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So we published this evidence checklist, and what we really wanted to do, we noticed the highly variable quality of reporting on a lot of these studies, from verification, analytical validation, clinical validation, usability, feasibility. And so what we did was actually develop this checklist that really gets into, and we hope several journal editors have already adopted it, where we really actually tease out, it's not a preferred, it's a required. You need to have patient input into all of this. And so this is sort of how we built it out. And this is where we're really trying to sort of educate and standardize best practices to getting this input, because it's so important. So whether it's actually reporting the demographics of folks that you recruited into your analytical validation, so we can see if it actually does perform well across populations. These things aren't routinely done in many of these studies. So the way that we've tackled this, and certainly it's not complete, there's a lot more work to do, is through our evidence checklist, and there's a link to this in the deck that will come through.
Thank you.
Awesome. And then I have a question from another person on whose mic is not working on their hospital computer, because that's what happens when you're within the hospital intranet. What role do you think big pharma can play in advancing digital health measures? Kind of what do you think pharmaceutical companies have a part to play in this work?
I actually think they have a really important role to play, right? I think that the value proposition is much clearer to pharma on the clinical side of using these measures, right? It's not just stripping away fee-for-service visits. It's actually sort of helping them be more efficient, and frankly, they need to be, right? There's lots of opportunity there, from identifying new digital phenotypes that could be more clear targets, to having more, to having better information earlier in the pipeline to make better no-go decisions, even to sell something into the post-market as a companion product, and presumably with an assumption that there would be an increased price point there, as well as, perhaps requiring a smaller sample size because we have more higher resolution data. There's statistical implications to words that I go to sometimes, and also at shorter timelines, right? So lots and lots, I think, of incentive for our pharma colleagues to go there first. And also because the high bar that our sort of life sciences colleagues are held to if they want to use these measures, I think that allows for really good translations of those measures into practice as we go forward. So I actually think they have a pretty enormous role in the future. And I, sort of look to them to some extent to be sort of leading the way here because the incentive structures align and because of decisions we've seen from FDA, for example. They're not going to look at digital measures that they don't see as being clinically meaningful or meaningful to the patient. And I think that's frankly terrific. It's a great filter.
Thank you. Dr. Huang, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Jennifer. I was flipping through the playbook, and I think it's really awesome. I think having these standardized measures will make it pretty easy for people to like compare between values or to deep dive into specific measures. And I'm curious, like, what do you think about the prospect of like patients learning to research and analyze their own data as a first step, kind of like how I think people search their symptoms online or on WebMD before deciding to go to make a doctor's appointment. I think that's fairly common. I imagine people might want to run their data through like maybe a quick or free online analyzer or discuss their data in a forum with their peers. I'm curious what you think about that.
I think it's brilliant. I think there's two things we need to be eyes wide open to, which is one, again, only 1 in 5 people have a smartwatch, for example, not quite 1 in 5 in the US, right? I think that, we need to be eyes wide open to who that isn't benefiting as well as who it is. I also think that we've seen an awful lot, sadly of late in particular, around like mis and disinformation being banded around health. We actually don't really know what a lot of these data mean out in the wild. We know that when we are frequently collecting blood pressure during a patient's everyday life, that data doesn't look like what we get during a clinic visit. So we don't actually know what the cut points are, right? We understand exactly what blood pressure is, but it's hard to make sort of inferences about that. There's a sort of movement in a sort of subset of people. There's actually a company now that buys, I think, CGMs from a medical product developer and then just sells them with no labeling that claims that there's an intended use. So you can casually monitor your glucose levels. You can think about that as you will, and I have opinions, but I won't share them. They are finding extraordinary data, right? They are finding like that some people spend enormous amount of time sort of out of range. We don't know any of these baseline data. So I think there's enormous promise in doing that. Dr. Wang, I think there's a huge opportunity to sort of democratize all of this. There's a huge opportunity to sort of unburden a little bit the healthcare system. I think as with all of this right now, we're at a sort of fork in the road moment around how are we going to make sure that this becomes available to everyone and how are we going to make sure that these data and this information isn't taken out of context.
Thank you. And God, isn't that the challenge of the moment, Jen? I mean, I feel like right
across the board.
And this is the thing with digital health, right? I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second, but really, this is the really exciting thing. We are defining a whole new field and all of the stuff that goes along with it. So we're defining the measurements. We're defining how we present the measurements to people in ways that make sense. We're defining how to use the measurements. And we're defining how to make sure that there's like these basic ethical privacy, misinformation safeguards around it. And there are lots of snake oil salesmen out there. Like you only have to look at Dr. Mercola to know how many hucksters put their physician hat on and claim to be selling something good. And so I think that we're going to be in this constant fight with digital health against those people who say that, your wearable is somehow gonna, I mean, Jeff and I have had this conversation, right? Like there's a lot there. So anyways, I know that we're at time, but any final kind of closing thoughts for us before?
No, it's I think the one thing that I would like to say is that I really value this collaboration. I think the one thing that our sort of discussion today shows us is that there's so much potential and so much work to do. So much better off sort of being in it together, driving forward together. And it was great to come and meet more of your colleagues and look forward to more collaboration and more discussions going forward.
Thank you. We're so thrilled to be partnering with you guys. And thank you to all for attending and look forward to seeing you. I think we're taking, John, we don't have another seminar until September, right? Do we have one next? Yeah.
We're taking a little break in August. Our next one is September 1st. We have 3 in September and a couple in October. So please be on the lookout.
And Jen, look forward to staying in touch and hopefully having some DIME folks continue to contribute your expertise in partnership.
Fantastic. This was terrific. Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.